I thought I had seen it all on night shift. Drug houses, domestic fights, the kind of human cruelty that leaves you hollow. But there are moments that sit in your chest and refuse to let go. 3 calls, 3 different houses, 3 nights. Each one left a mark you can't scrub off. I'm a K9 handler. My dog's name is Rex. Between him and me, we've chased more suspects than I can count, searched basements no one wanted to go down, and learned to trust each other without second-guessing. That trust is why. When Rex stopped and refused to go into a bedroom, I listened. It was quiet for a Saturday night. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The hush of closed blinds and cars sleeping in driveways. Dispatch gave us a possible suspect fled call after a neighbor saw someone run from a house and jump a fence. We were 2 units, me with Rex and Chris in the cruiser behind us. Night shift, city lights throwing stripes across the pavement. I remember thinking, half joking, that the only thing we'd find was an empty beer can and a raccoon. The house was a single-story ranch with an unlocked back door. The yard had been left to itself. Beyond that, nothing to mark it as unusual. The back door swung in easy when Chris gave a soft knock and called out, "Police, stay where you are." No answer. We fed Rex the scent from a towel the neighbor had handed over. Brown grass, hot pavement, and the faint chemical tang you get from someone who had been on the move. He hit the lead and pulled the line out smooth and sure, his nose working like a machine. We moved through the house with the practiced rhythm of officers who've done this 100 times. Lights off, flashlights cutting cones through the dark, our boots whispering on the hardwood. The living room smelled of old smoke and something sweet, like candle wax left too long. Rex led us down a short hall toward the bedrooms. He tracked low, deliberate. His body told me he was locked on scent, tail halfway up, shoulders hunched forward, one paw lifted like a metronome. At the end of the hallway, he stopped. Not a pause in that searching way dogs do when they're thinking. He stopped as if someone had struck a block in front of him. He turned his head in the direction of the closed bedroom door and his eyes fixed. He pressed his muzzle against the air like he could read it. Then he growled, deep, throaty, and low in a way I'd never heard from him. Chris glanced at me. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. "Rex, heel," I said. Soft command. He didn't back down. He stiffened, every muscle taut. He wouldn't take another step. "On my command," I said louder, testing him. He pushed forward with the leash and then froze again, like something invisible was holding him back. I moved around to open the door. The knob turned without resistance. The hinges creaked soft. The room was empty, windows shut, curtains drawn. A twin bed pressed into the corner with a blanket folded clean at the foot. A dresser against the far wall. No footprints on the hardwood. No clothing on the floor. Nothing that suggested someone had been there more recently than the dust on the windowsill. My light swept across the ceiling and down the walls. The air felt still. No breath, no lived-in clutter. It should have been a relief. Instead, my stomach dropped. Rex's ears flattened. He tugged backward on the lead, tight as a cable. He barked once, short and sharp, right at the corner where the bed met the wall. The sound of that bark echoed in the tiny room and seemed to hang there. Chris stepped in, flashlight cutting across the carpet, and called out, "You good?" My voice stuck in my throat like I'd swallowed something heavy. We searched the room thoroughly. We went through the closet, checked under the bed, felt around the mattress and inside the drawers. We swept the floors with our hands. The house was structurally normal. No hidden compartments, no false walls, no crawl spaces anyone could have used to hide in that moment. The windows were latched from the inside. No sign anyone had forced their way through them. When we cleared the room, I expected Rex to relax, to follow me out like he always did. He didn't. He planted himself like a statue at the threshold and set his jaw to the air. His hackles were up. He refused to cross that line. We went through the rest of the house, and nothing. No one in the basement, no one in the pantry, no fingerprints on the kitchen counter beyond the homeowners. We checked the yard, the shed. Chris and I split the perimeter like choreography, radioing dispatch the whole time. The neighbor, who stayed outside with his hands in his pockets, told us he'd seen a person run through the back gate, head down, hoodie up. He'd followed with his eyes until the figure disappeared behind the house. The street cameras, such as they were, showed only blurs. We ran a canine check around the property again. Rex walked the same path he'd taken before, and at the bedroom door he stopped and stared. He wouldn't be coaxed. He wouldn't be commanded. He wouldn't work. I've worked Rex through fire alarms, storm front winds, and gatherings of stray dogs. He's steady. That night, he looked like a dog that had just seen something he wasn't meant to see. We called it in. Canine refusing entry into bedroom, suspect not located. Dispatch acknowledged. It felt ridiculous to write down that a dog had refused to enter a room like it was a formal incident report. But that's what we did. We documented the time, the location, the behavior. Protocol insists on facts. The facts were, dog refused to enter, room empty, no suspect found. After we left, I ran that image through my head until it frayed. I replayed the way Rex's body had gone rigid. I replayed the sound of his bark in that small room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I found myself lining up the options like a checklist. Maybe some scent I hadn't noticed. Maybe an animal behind the wall, maybe a neighbor's cat that had climbed in and out through a vent. None of those possibilities fit neatly. The room didn't smell like animal. There were no claw marks, no hair, nothing to indicate a wild thing had been there. The next morning, I took Rex to the vet for a check, neurological assessment, basic blood work, because when a police dog behaves out of character, you verify the dog first. Fully healthy, no sign of a problem, that only deepened the unease. I drove back past the house weeks later on my way home, on an off-duty night with my kid asleep in the back seat. The porch light was on, the curtains open, and the television glow painting the curtains in a domestic wash of light. Kid's sneakers sat on the stoop. A bicycle leaned on the lawn. Normal. Nothing to suggest the previous week's scene. I sat in my cruiser in the dark for a long minute and watched the house breathe like any ordinary house. I thought of Rex, of the way he had stayed at that doorway as if the air itself was the boundary. We never found a person who'd been in that room. No missing persons reports fit the timeline. The neighbor was sure of what he'd seen. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. Sometimes in the dark I can feel that same hesitation, my mind stopping at a door it can't explain. There are things dogs pick up because they are dogs, and there are things no one has an explanation for. I file both under unexplained and I keep working. If you want more real police accounts like this, if you want to hear the calls that stick with us, hit subscribe. There are more nights to tell. The second night I'm going to tell you about began with wind and a radio call that sounded like someone had rerouted it through a broken walkie-talkie. We were 2 squads out because the dispatcher flagged the call as a 911 hang-up, but the line was intact. Claire at dispatch, that calm voice over the radio, picked up a call from a number that pinged as local. The voice on the other end wasn't one voice so much as a layering of tones, high and childlike at times, then suddenly an adult's throat making the same syllable sound like it had been forced into a different shape. It was distorted, like someone speaking through a mouthful of cotton. She logged it as possible child online, unclear location. She played it back for me. Even over the speakers, your skin tightens. The weather made the whole city feel older. Thunder filled the horizon, and the power was twitchy in places. When we pulled up, the streetlights flickered as if they were deciding whether to commit. The house we were sent to looked from the outside like it had been waiting. Gray vinyl siding gone almost uniform with grime, a porch sagging a little on one side. The windows were caked with rain and something darker. A single stoop light buzzed. The mailbox sagged with old flyers. It could have belonged to any number of people, but there was a smell even before we stepped onto the porch, the kind of sweet rot you get when something has been left in the heat too long and forgotten. We knocked. No answer. The front door was cracked just enough for a small, narrow light to slip out. I remember thinking how ordinary the crack looked, like a house that expected company and didn't notice the late hour. There were toys on the porch, plastic cars, a doll whose hair had been combed into one stiff braid. One of the dolls on the porch wore a dress that looked adult in scale, stitched badly, almost as if someone had dressed it with a certain purpose. My partner, a rookie whose nerves were still new to this business, made a joke to keep the mood light. It didn't land. Inside we could hear the house working, pipes settling, the wind finding gaps in the siding. The living room was a study in neglect. Food wrappers and stained cushions. A pattern of things left where they'd been used and then abandoned. Some rooms were chaotic, piles of magazines and food containers. Then oppositely, there were sections that were unnaturally organized. Stacks of women's clothing folded with surgical neatness on a bed, shirts arranged by color like a retail display. The contrast made my skin prickle. The sense one room gave of personhood, the scattered mess of someone living their life, was offset by the meticulousness of other spaces, making the place feel like two minds had been living under the same roof, with very different rules. Claire patched through whatever bits of information she could pull from the line. The caller's voice, she said, had repeated a single phrase several times, like a child saying a nursery rhyme over and over. It was crossed by a rasp that suggested someone older. As we swept the ground floor, we called for a telephonic warrant. There are nights you can get away with a soft entry and nights where protocol is a shield, and this felt like the latter. We had backup on the way, but with every minute the storm seemed to lean on the house harder, like thunder itself was trying to press inside. Upstairs, the bedrooms told stories. One had a bed pulled tight, and a stuffed animal on the pillow, its face worn to the nub from being loved. Another room had the same folded clothing, but this time the garments were different, sizes and styles that suggested they didn't belong to a single person. On a dresser, there was a photograph with the frame blurred by water spots. You could see the shadow of a group, but not the faces. I noticed a child's drawing on the wall, hard crayons, a figure with two long arms. Rookie kept glancing at it and then shoving his hands in his pockets like he wanted to put the images away. We moved through the house with the careful patience of officers doing a welfare check. Doors clicked shut after us. We called upstairs, cleared rooms methodically. Every time we paused, the house answered back with an odd sound, something like a muffled shuffle, as if someone were moving just beyond the wall. Down in the kitchen, we found toys in a drawer and a doll seated at the table, propped up as if it had been waiting for dinner. The doll's eyes stared too openly. The sight put a weight on the room that had nothing to do with the storm. When the telephonic warrant came through, voice of the magistrate over the line granting permission to search, the mood shifted into a focused machine. You watch a room differently once the paperwork is in order. We had authority to be thorough. We split into teams. Rookie and I took the upstairs hallway and worked our way to the bedrooms again, listening for anything that might be disguised as the house's natural noises. Somewhere below us, something scraped or thumped lightly. It was easy to tell each other we were being paranoid. It's better for the mind to make sense of small noises than to let doubt fester. But the scrape came again, deliberate this time, and the sound of something being dragged. "I heard that," Rookie said under his breath, voice tight. He was good, green but good. He had that look of someone trying to appear calm while his hands did the opposite. We moved down the stairs, boots soft on the treads. The basement doorway was a narrow trap, half hidden behind a pantry door in the back of the kitchen, the kind of arrangement that makes you think, why would anyone design it that way? A thin, cold draft spilled out when the pantry door opened, gusting the edge of the hanging coats. The smell hit low now, the metallic tang that told you blood had been shed at some point, or at least something had gone bad in a way that left iron in the air. It's a smell that claws at your throat. "Channel 2 to dispatch, we're going to clear the basement. Possible victim," I said. "Calm into the radio because you keep the place steady with the voice." Chris and Claire confirmed ETA for backup. 7 minutes. Better than nothing, but in a house where someone might be chained or trapped, 7 minutes can be an eternity. We switched to loud, simple commands in the stairwell. "Police, stay where you are!" The words bounced off concrete. It felt like a stage whisper, too small for the space. There was silence and then, after a pause that stretched thin, the faintest reply. It sounded human. It sounded like someone trying to form words around a cloth, like someone with little air and less practice at speaking. Rookie tried to keep his voice steady when he asked, "Hey, can you hear me? We're here to help." The reply was a single exhalation that turned into the sound of someone sobbing, and then a broken word that might have been a name. My radio crackled with Claire asking for location confirmation. We fed her what we had. She told us the caller had said earlier that they were afraid of the dark. The childish pitch overlaying an older rasp kept coming back in my head. At the bottom of the stairs there was a heavy door. Basement doors often are, with rusted hinges and locks that say they were meant to keep something in. The handle had been lashed with what looked like rope marks. There were tear stains on the wood near the knob, like someone had tried to grab and pull it and been stopped. The sense of a struggle, old or recent, hung there in the air like a second presence. We put our shoulders to the door and pushed. It yielded with a tired groan. Then there was a sound that I'll hear the rest of my life. The sudden hard intake of breath you hear when someone's body remembers a violence before their face does. It was followed by the inhalation of damp air and then movement. Deep, frantic movement, somebody trying to crawl, to shift. A voice, raw and small, choked out the word, "Please." Rookie and I slipped in first. The basement was a low-ceilinged room that smelled like old oil and sweat, crowded with boxes and the detritus of long storage. In the far corner, pressed against cinder block, was the outline of a small frame coiled in a blanket, the kind of folded shiver that makes your eyes fasten. I remember moving toward it like an instinct, not a decision. The blanket shifted. For a second I thought it was a child. Then the shape unfolded into a man, thin, his eyes wide with a look that was part terror, part relief, like someone surfacing from too long underwater. He looked older than he said on the call. His hair was ragged. His hands bore marks of restraint. He whispered something we couldn't understand, and then, in the next breath, his voice became that high, childish clip we'd heard on the 911 recording. Rookie swore under his breath and reached for his cuffs to loosen them gently. He smiled like he didn't want to scare the man. There were bruises, but they weren't the grotesque stuff you see on the worst cases. They were methodical, lines of old restraint and fresh ones of a recent fight. We radioed Claire for medical and an ETA for transport. The man was coherent but fragile. He said his name when we asked, then stopped and asked us to promise we would take him away from here. He told us things in fragments. How long he'd been there, that it felt like years. But the timeline was fuzzy, like it has been for others we've rescued. A rescue is never clean. People's minds fold back on themselves to protect what they can. I remember thinking, in that moment, about the doll on the porch and the folded clothes upstairs and how the house seemed to split its personality like someone keeping two personas at once. There was a catalog of items that made you feel something beyond physical harm. A stack of adult clothes folded with the care of someone who wanted their life orderly, and the presence of toys like trophies, each one a thing not meant for the same hands. As Chris secured the perimeter and Rookie comforted the man on the blanket, I climbed the short stairwell to the kitchen, where I found an odd arrangement of objects on a counter. Small corsages, a dozen photographs face down, a child's crayon drawing with a heart scratched through it. At the sink, the water had been recently run. It was like someone had tried to wash evidence into oblivion but hadn't finished. The storm outside tapped at the windows like a watchman. We had to wait for the telephonic judge's signature on the warrant to begin a full inventory and arrest process. While we waited, I called for medical and placed a hold on evidence collection until forensic could come out. The paperwork is always the long shadow after the adrenaline. You get your hands dirty. Then you spend hours filling out boxes. We sat in the kitchen while the man was wrapped in a thermal blanket, and the Rookie tried to ask basic questions that don't feel intrusive at the time. He kept asking about what the man wanted to eat, what his allergies were, normal things to bring a human back to actual living. Outside, the thunder rolled on and the power blinked. I remember the feeling of being in a room that holds a secret and then discovers it has been discovered. Everything seemed exaggerated. The drip of a faucet, the whine of a fluorescent light, the scratch of a marker cap. Before the telephonic warrant was finalized, before forensics could take over, an officer found a door that led to a crawl space under the back porch. It was narrow and low and tucked out of sight. The officer poked a flashlight in and saw a collection of items wrapped in plastic sheeting. We moved to secure them while still keeping the man's medical needs in check. The items were placed in paper bags for chain of custody. We did what we could to preserve the scene. There was a point, one of those quiet, practical moments when you can almost forget the human on the blanket and focus entirely on evidence and procedure. When Rookie looked at me and said, quiet enough for only me to hear, "Do you think, could the 911 have been manipulated?" He meant the childlike voice over the line. He meant the way the man's voice blurred and the way the dolls and toys sat like sentinels. I had the same thought, not because I wanted to sensationalize it, but because the pieces didn't neatly stack. The voice on the phone could have been a tactic, a method of control, or the fractured result of prolonged abuse. It might have been a deliberate mimicry by the abuser, or it might have been the result of the victim's survival mechanism, reverting to a childlike tone to placate whoever held him. Either way, it pushed the situation past the ordinary seam of domestic crime and into something that feels more like psychological design. We were cleared to move forward with evidence collection once the judge signed and backup arrived in force. Forensics began their sweep. They worked with gloves and hush, running lights over surfaces like surgeons with pens. Their faces didn't change. You learned to look similar when confronted with the aftermath of control. The homeowner, when we finally found him, was dragged out from a back room in the upstairs wing. He was arrested on the spot. We had probable cause by then, and the teleporting momentum that comes with paperwork and witnesses. He said nothing to the cameras, his mouth a hard line that read like a refusal. He was cuffed and read rights, the ritual you see on every show but which never feels glamorous in real life. I won't pretend we had all the answers that night. Even with an arrest, the why sits like a stone in the throat. The man we brought out was alive, breathing, and scared, and yet a piece of the story remained oddly open. How long had this been going on? How many times had the house's duality been a deliberate play? The victim's recollection was splintered. That's often the case. Trauma takes pieces to keep its core intact. We did what we could. Medical transport, arrests, evidence logged, statements taken. The prosecutor would decide on charges and follow-up investigations would unfold in the days to come. But there are things a paper trail can't fix. Minds to mend, nights to close. The man we rescued would need more than a hospital and court appearances. He would need therapy and time and the kind of tenderness that's hard to come by. As we left, the storm had moved on, leaving the air sharp and smelling of washed pavement. I stood on the porch for a minute with Rookie beside me, both of us tired in the way that comes from seeing one human being reduced by another's cruelty. He asked me quietly, "Do you think the voice could be explained?" I looked across the yard at the place where the doll had sat on the porch, and at the kitchen window through which the light fell in that domestic rectangle. I said, "We found a man alive and we found a house full of things that don't line up. That's what we know. The rest, how the voice got that way, what it means, has to be left to the investigation." It was the only honest answer. In situations like that, honesty is a kind of anchor. The rest you accept is unknown. We processed the scene into the early hours. Forensics took photographs and lifts and samples. The man was loaded into an ambulance with a paramedic who had learned the softest of voices. The homeowner was read rights and led away protesting or perhaps pleading. I couldn't tell anymore. Rookie sat in the cruiser and watched the rain. He was the kind of officer who wanted his firsts to make sense. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they only leave you with a feeling that the world broke somewhere you can't see. We filed our reports and turned the scene over. But certain images don't leave you. The clothes folded with care. The toys arranged like evidence, not playthings. The voice that layered child and adult in a way that made your hands clench. There are nights like that. Nights where the city feels like a machine with a hidden cog of abuse that you only find when you stick your hand in. We'd only just started to separate what evidence could tell us from the stories people carry in their heads. There was paperwork to file and statements to take, and something in my chest that didn't let go. I drove home with the wipers taking steady bites out of the windshield and the radio playing a morning traffic report, like it had no idea what had just happened in the house we left behind. That case would later come up in debriefs and interviews. It would be cited in a warrant affidavit, and in a prosecutor's notes. But there was a part of it that the paperwork never captured, the way the house arranged itself into a living archive of one person's method and another person's suffering. There was a gap between the physical evidence and the emotional truth, and that gap is where you sleep poorly. Not far from that, later in the month, a third call came across that, like the others, started small and then opened into something wider. The 911 line lit up with a hang-up. Responding units reported nothing on approach, then found a front door cracked open on a street lined with ordinary porches. It was a summer night, humid and close, with the scent of cut grass thick across the cul-de-sacs. We cleared the front yard slowly, flashlights carving across sleeping cars and swing sets. A neighbor had called, nervous because someone had phoned and then gone silent. The entryway to that house felt different in its ordinariness. Curtains parted, a welcome mat with a faded slogan, a pair of kid-size sandals kicked to the side. You never know what normal hides. We moved in the standard formation, me in front, flashlight down low, checking rooms as we advanced. The upstairs had the sleep stillness of rooms people had left for the night. Then we found the bathroom door ajar and a smear across the inside of the frame that wasn't soap or paint. It was the red of a bruise in broad daylight, clinical and obvious. Not cinematic, not something to spice up a story. It was a mark of trauma. We called for medics and asked for K9 assistance. The search switched into the mechanical pace of protocol. Search the house, secure the perimeter, call for backup, run plates in case the owner was on any watch lists. The sense that you are moving through someone's private life is always there. In the kitchen, a pantry door had been replaced by an old shelving unit that someone had pushed in front of a narrow stairway. It read like concealment done by a person who wanted to hide something, not by a person who'd simply misplaced it. The stairs beyond the pantry weren't a proper basement descent. They were steep and dangling into a dark cleft. At the bottom we found a chair with slices where zip ties had been cut, crusted at the edges. The floor had a dark pool, not a cinematic torrent, but enough to indicate blood, pragmatic and clinical in how it announced harm. Then the noises started, something scraping, then the sound of a body moving at the edge of hearing. I was the first down those stairs. My light fought with dust and the smell that hit me lower than the breath. At the end of the room, a shape moved and then bolted for the door, a figure launching through a broken basement window like someone with nothing left to lose. We chased, sprinted across wet yard and hedges, and the figure disappeared into the night. We secured a perimeter and called for K9. Rex came out of his cruiser eager and precise, but the scent trail was broken like a snapped rope. We followed what we could for several blocks, through thickets and fences, and then the trail went cold. No tracks, no sightings, and an empty window that looked like it had been used as an escape route. We canvassed the neighborhood, woke residents, and scoured alleyways until exhaustion made our eyes heavy. We ran the initial checks and opened a missing person report tied to the house. We called in units from neighboring districts. We did the things a department does when someone slips through your hands. Papers filed, footage requested, tips logged. At the house, forensics lifted prints and sealed the chair. There was a quietness that felt like a person sitting with you, who knows everything but refuses to speak. We all felt foolish and urgent at the same time. You do every reasonable thing you can, and then you go home to a bed that doesn't make you sleep. I drove past that house months later on an off-hour patrol. A different family had moved in. There were flowers planted near the stoop and a mailbox that didn't sag. Children's laughter floated out at times in the late afternoon. The neighborhood looked healed. But inside me there was a list of unanswered questions the size of a ledger. Where did the person go? Did he get away and survive? Or was there something else the night hid from us? Some cases close with paperwork and citations. Others remain gaps. The missing persons file sits on a shelf in a drawer in the station, and sometimes I flip through the notes like a talisman. These are the things that keep you turning the wheel on your cruiser at 2 in the morning. Images of empty beds, the sound of a dog's bark against a blank wall, voices layered like tapes. You learn to live with the not knowing because often that's all you get. Night after night you go out to try and piece together the smallest truths and hope they amount to justice. But justice and understanding are two different things. One follows the paper trail. The other, understanding, sometimes never arrives. There are more nights like these. There are more stories of doors that refuse to tell, voices that sound like children and not, basements that swallow the last traces of a person's life. Between the routine and the extraordinary, there's a line we cross every time we step over a threshold in the dark. We file reports. We take evidence. We press charges when we can. And when the job is done, the scene remains with you in a way that paperwork never captures. You could say we get hardened. Maybe we do. But there are moments that fracture that armor, moments when a K9 who has always been steady stops at a doorway, and the air itself seems to insist on silence. Those are the nights that change you. Those are the nights you drive past a house years later, and it looks like any other house on the block, because the ordinary is very good at hiding the extraordinary. I still drive those streets some nights, not because the job requires me to, but because the city keeps offering the same small, ordinary shapes that hide the things we saw. There's a certain ritual that follows nights like those. Coffee in the squad room at dawn, a stack of forms, a debrief with whoever's available. We sit in a circle that looks like support and sometimes is, and we trade the concrete pieces, times, weapon status, who gave what radio call. Those details matter. They keep the record straight. They also keep us from slipping into the kind of storytelling that smooths corners until everything looks like horror movie easy. But paperwork can't fix the sound that sticks to you. It can't unhear the bark that echoes against air with nothing to answer it, or the voice that seemed two people at once on a 911 line, or the muffled sprint out of a basement window into darkness. For a long time after those nights, I caught myself checking my back seat at red lights, or walking the hallway of my house with the small light on, listening for a scuff that might be nothing. My kid would ask why I sat at the foot of his bed once, and I told him I couldn't sleep without checking the house was right. It's true. You become the kind of person who checks things twice because you know what a moment's complacency can cost. We have rituals at the station for this, too. After big scenes, we run a proper debrief. We talk about what we saw and what we did, and we make sure everyone who needs resources gets them. Critical incident stress teams, peer support, and offer to sit down with counseling. Some of us take that seriously. Others nod and say they're fine and go home and drink too much coffee or smoke until their hands shake. I'm not telling you this to moralize. I'm telling you because part of why these nights stick with me is the way some of the officers around me folded the memory into ordinary phrases and kept moving. That's how we survive. That's also how some parts of us stay raw. Rex adjusted in his own way. After that night at the bedroom door, he was quieter for a couple days. He wouldn't sleep with his head on his paws the way he usually did. Instead, he'd sit at my side and stare at the hallway like he expected something to come through. I took him on extra runs, long stretches where he could chase and be just a dog again, and it helped. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a K9 after a rough call is to let them be a dog. Not a partner, not a tool, just a living animal who can run and sniff and forget for a while. The rookie from the storm house called me after his shift the next week. He was quieter than he'd been on the scene, not the nervous joke-making version. He asked a few practical questions about paperwork, and then, more quietly, he asked if it ever got easier. If the noises you hear in a house ever stop sounding like people. I told him what older guys told me when I was green. It doesn't get easier so much as you get better at carrying it. You learn to separate what you can fix from what you have to let be unresolved. That's not a trait I'd wish on anyone, but it's the reality. Some people try to make sense of these nights by filing them under obvious labels. Purely procedural, purely criminal, purely supernatural. That's not how it sits with me. These calls forced me to occupy an uncomfortable middle ground where the human capacity for cruelty is sometimes all the explanation you need, like the house with the folded clothes and the toys, and sometimes not enough, like the bedroom where Rex stopped, and nothing we could find tied a timeline to it. There are hours where the human explanation is the only reasonable one. There are other hours where reasonable explanations feel too small for what the senses insist they witnessed. We're trained to look for practical answers. We look for prints, fibers, DNA, a footprint in the mulch. Those things lead you somewhere. For the cases that remain open, the missing person who slipped out a basement window, the bedroom with no trace of a living person, we file leads and run them when we have them. We check footage, interview neighbors, and follow the paper trail. Sometimes that yields arrests and court dates. Sometimes it yields nothing more than a folder on a shelf and a case number you pull up years later, on a slow morning. The unknown in those folders becomes a small private grief that officers carry differently than families do. It's less visible, but it's there. Inevitably, the public side of these calls becomes a string of records and headlines, or, in the best of times, a quick relief when things end with an arrest and a person taken to care. The rescue in that damp basement ended the night with paramedics in cuffs and an arrested homeowner. That man's life moved into the churn of courts and prosecution, and the victim got what immediate care we could give him. But the psychological architecture of what had been done in that house, the way toys were placed, the way a grown man's voice could tilt into something childlike under duress, that part didn't get fixed by an arrest alone. It began a process that courts and therapy try to address, but the scar remains in the room and in the people who entered it. The escaped basement case sits differently. You can file 100 motions, interview 100 witnesses, and still come up short. Our K9 did everything he could. The scent trail either broke clean or someone broke it deliberately. Sometimes people slip beyond reach of the immediate manhunt by hiding in urban folds we don't have eyes on, or by getting help from someone else, or by being skilled at vanishing. Sometimes they don't get away. We simply don't know. That not knowing is a heavy concrete thing that sits on the file and in the officers who chased and didn't catch. Every so often I visit the places we were called to, not for nostalgia or voyeurism, never that, but because there's a practical reason. Seeing the house months later gives a different view. Sometimes it's healing, sometimes it's flat-out eerie. That ranch house with the bedroom that made Rex refuse entry looked normal on the night I drove by. A bike on the lawn, a light on. Later, the same street had holiday decorations and a barbecue out in the yard. Normal, ordinary, able to host a life that mostly runs on the rails. That normal is the hardest thing to reconcile with the night when the door opened on nothing and a dog wouldn't cross. I can tell you the small rituals that helped me. I kept a notebook in the cruiser for a while and wrote down the odd images after shift before they could be softened by sleep or coffee or talk. I made sure to talk to someone who would listen properly, someone who would say, "That sounds heavy," and then help me unpack it without judgment. I learned to let the job be the job when I was home. No one wants their partner to bring the weight of a basement into the living room where taxes and homework live. But some things bleed through. My wife knew enough to notice when I took longer routes home. My kid asked fewer questions and accepted the check of a light on in the hallway. Those small domestic negotiations are part of how a family survives when one of them walks into danger for a living. On the station wall where we hang commendations and notations, there's also a folder for the list of open files that never quite close. You open that drawer sometimes when you're bored or want to feel useful. You read the dates and the notes, and you feel the shape of unsolved things like a weight. That weight sits next to the pride in the things we do succeed at. Rescues, arrests, a missing person found and returned. Policing is a ledger of both ends more often than not. People sometimes ask me if I believe in the supernatural after a night like that, when a dog refuses a doorway or a voice sounds like someone else. I answer honestly, I don't know. It's not a clever dodge. It's literally the truth. We file things as unexplained when they are unexplained. We don't call it a haunting in a report. We don't write ghost in an affidavit. But on quiet nights, I will tell you this. There are moments where you see things that have no satisfying explanation. And to every soul that's ever worked a midnight shift, there's a humility that comes with admitting limits. Whether that limit is because someone is good at hiding, or because there is something else, unseen, undescribed, I cannot say. I can only speak to what I experienced, the state of my dog, the sound of a voice, the absence of physical trace. Those are the facts I am comfortable giving. We do on occasion find small closure. A neighbor calls back and remembers a license plate. A camera turns out to have caught a blurred hatch of movement that becomes a breakthrough. In other cases, we watch the file age while the family waits and grows tired, and the officers who worked the case move on to the next shift. The human cost for a victim is immediate and raw. The human cost for an officer is slower and cumulative. You trade nights of sleep for a few moments of clarity. You trade certainty for acceptance. You learn to live beside the unknown. I tell these stories because the public deserves to know that what we do at night is not always neat or cinematic or solved. It's messy, sometimes cruel, and occasionally beyond our ability to explain. You deserve to know both what we can fix and what we can't. It's important for trust that people understand the limits of our job as well as its reach. And it's important for those who hear our calls to understand that the language we use, unexplained, refused entry, missing person, isn't a dramatization. It's a careful, factual way to write down the things that stayed with us. If there's a takeaway from those nights, it's that ordinary places can host extraordinary things. A bedroom with made bed, a living room with toys, a basement with a window that breaks. Those are ordinary elements until the night you walk into them, and their ordinariness fractures. We go into houses partly to restore a sense of order, and sometimes the best we can do is file the facts and accompany people to the next steps. Other times we leave with more questions than answers. That's a part of the job most people don't see. I still have the files, digital, neat, labeled, and I have the memory of wrecks at the doorway, of a man folded into a blanket in a concrete basement, of an escape into a humid night. Those images get lodged in the little catalog that makes up years on this shift. Sometimes I talk about them because telling holds them at arm's length. Sometimes I don't talk about them because saying them out loud makes them feel too real. Either way, they are true in the sense that I live them, and in the sense that paperwork backs them up. They are haunting because they left parts undone. That perhaps is the worst part, the unsatisfied endings. Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Tell me in the comments. Was it the night Rex refused to cross the threshold? The man we pulled from a basement that smelled of rust and old living? Or the figure who bolted out the window and vanished into the dark? If you want more real accounts from Night Shift, the calls that linger and the things we can't explain, subscribe and we'll keep telling them. There are more nights, more houses, and more doors that look like any other until you step over the line. I'll leave you with this thought. The dark doesn't create monsters. It only hides them until someone opens a door. Sometimes, even when you have the flashlight and the badge, the door stays closed to something you can't name. Those are the nights that follow you home. Those are the ones that haunt.